Good evening. I'd like you to remind you to turn off your cell phones if you haven't done so already. Okay. And have we taken a moment to thank our archivists in the library? I think they deserve maybe some applause for the putting together the conference. So I'd like to introduce Barry Lopez. Many of us in this audience tonight know Barry already, and many of us know him fairly well. And we know him well because he has spent time with us here on the campus of Texas Tech University every semester, fall and spring, for some 20 years. And in that time, as Texas Tech's first and only distinguished visiting scholar, Barry has helped us to develop a world-class archive made up of the papers of some of America's finest writers, the archive around which we gather as a community for this conference each year. He has worked with students in the classroom and in the field, traveling in vans and cooking and sleeping under the stars in places like Medicine Mounds near Quanah, Texas, Paladuro Canyon, Toole Canyon, Adobe Walls, and the Muleshoe National Wildlife Refuge. He has extended an invitation to welcome our neighbors to the north, the Comanche people, to see if we can work together, because this land, the Llano Estacado, has long been a Comanche homeland. And Barry has served as a guide and mentor and inspiration, not only to students, but to staff and to faculty and to administrators. There are many fine writers, but there is no writer finer than Barry Lopez. He is the recipient of many awards and honors, among them the National Book Award, one of the highest honors for an American writer. He has traveled widely and deeply, living and working in more than 80 countries, because he knows that a writer must go out into it, into what he has called the great mystery, to see it, to listen to it, to feel it, to be humbled before it. Barry has a new book out just this past spring, a big, beautiful blue book that takes its reader on a journey to 6 regions of the world. It is an intimate portrait of these places, as intimate a portrait of these places as it is of its writer. And others who know what they're talking about have called this book honest, wise, seductive, sorrowful, glorious, unmatched. The book is titled Horizon. If I may speak for all of us here tonight and for the greater Texas Tech community, we are grateful to you, Barry, for the way in which you honor us by giving voice to what we did not know we needed to hear, for reminding us of what we once knew but had forgotten, for pointing the way to what we share with animals and what they would share with us, for sharing with us your time, your care, your careful attention, and for sharing your heart. Please welcome Barry Lopez.
I asked him if he expected me to read after that. Thank you, Kurt. What I have been thinking about carefully, I hope, for the last decade or so is the social responsibility of the American writer in times like these, which are like no other any of us have ever known. So this is a reflection on that. Several weeks ago, I picked up the September issue of the New York Review of Books. I knew what I was about to see had been in the works for a while, and read a generous and very thoughtful review of a book of mine called Horizon. I can't quote you any lines from it. I don't think it's a good idea to try to remember your reviews, favorable or unfavorable. But I can quickly and easily recall the artwork that accompanied that piece. On one page was a pen and ink drawing, a portrait of me, and on the other was a photo of an Alaska Fish and Game wildlife biologist and me radio-collaring two sedated wolves in Nelchina Basin, south of the Alaska Range in south-central Alaska. It was taken 43 years ago in March of 1976. I've thought about that photograph often over the past few weeks. The biologist, Bob Stevenson, who died in 2017, became a lifelong friend, and in the years after we met, we traveled across much of the state together, up the Yukon River nearly to Canada, out to St. Lawrence Island in the northern Bering Sea, up to Anaktuvuk Pass in the central Brooks Range, a small village of 110 Inupiaq Eskimos, Nunamiut, they're called, where years before Bob had bought a sod house and where, because he was so warmly welcome, I was welcome too. The last time we actually camped together in Alaska was in the summer of 1979 in the drainage of the Utaqaq River in the far western foothills of the Brooks Range. In the years that followed our first meeting in 1976, I found the subject that I think lies at the heart of much of my writing. Certainly, it is apparent in Of Wolves and Men and in Arctic Dreams, but it is also there in Horizon and in dozens of short stories and essays. It is the unfathomable nature of wild animals, often seen from a non-Western or indigenous perspective, a frame of mind Bob first introduced me to in our conversations with Nunamiut people and later with Yupik Eskimos on St. Lawrence Island. I've given you more background here than you probably need in describing a person I feel profoundly indebted to as a writer, a teacher, if you will, without whose help and friendship the world I didn't know I wanted to be in dramatically opened up. Over the years, readers have sometimes innocently confused me or conflated me with the people I travel with or interview. They were the teachers. I was the listener, the reader's conduit to knowledge possessed by others. I was not the expert, they were. Over decades of exposure to such people, I changed as a man. I came into another epistemology than the one I was born with, and which I carried intact into my adolescence. I became, as many before me have, resident in a kind of ecotone. I was comfortable with my own people, but also not. In my travels, I often sat with traditional people somewhere out bush in their country and observed with them for hours wild animals, without comment. I became acutely aware over time that I was experiencing and learning things for which my own culture, figuratively speaking, has no words, and about which my culture is suspicious. I'm talking especially about characterizations of the numinous as they are perceived and interpreted by other cultures. Numinous, the dimensions of life that lie beyond the reach of rational minds and the senses, and which are associated with perceptions of the holy or divine nature of life. In graduate school in Oregon in the late 60s, I studied Native American culture and American folklore with a pioneering scholar in both those fields, a man named Barry Tolkien. When he was a young man in the 1950s, he left the University of Massachusetts to prospect for uranium on the Navajo Reservation near Blanding, Utah. After some time in this situation, he grew disaffected and finally appalled by his behavior, prospecting on Navajo land for uranium with the company that employed him. He quit and took up life on the reservation. He later married a Navajo woman, and they had their first child. When his wife was killed in an automobile accident, he was devastated. Barry told me once that he had read too many books as a young man to live comfortably forever on the Navajo reservation. His father-in-law told him the family would care for his daughter and that it would be best for everyone if he returned to college and got his degree. "Don't forget us," Yellow Man said to his son-in-law when he departed. In class one day in Oregon, when we were talking about cross-cultural experiences and the nature of the numinous, the part of nature, again, that surpasses human comprehension or understanding, Barry said, by way of characterizing some of his interactions with his Navajo relatives to the surrounding landscape, "If I hadn't believed it, I wouldn't have seen it." My late good friends, Barry Tolkien and Bob Stevenson, who never met, would have appreciated each other's awareness of the world. I was a student of both these men. They both opened doors for me, and I am in their debt. I told them this respectfully and expressed my gratitude often in the years that we continued to see each other. Over time, I've been publishing work for 53 years now. I have heard many definitions of the person we call a writer in our society. Most of these descriptions cite the social importance of a writer's independent mind, the writer's capacity and even responsibility to disturb the status quo, and the value to society of a writer's artistic vision. I believe in these things too, and also that the writer is not a shill for any political agenda or either part of a public relations effort for any worthy cause. For here we drift away from literature and into the landscape of propaganda. The writer, to my way of thinking, is no one's hired hand promoting the social or cultural agenda of one or another group, though her work in some cases might easily be read that way. The writer's importance in any society, in my view, can't be properly defined by fame or by her volume of production. If I were forced to come up with an essential description of any particular writer's career, I would say that it is to be found in the answer to this deceptively simple question: did her life help? Well, this is a question the writer herself obviously cannot legitimately answer. Only the reader can do that. The question nevertheless serves the writer in the course of her life, I believe. It defines the calling. In my own life, I have asked myself questions like these. Have I, as a writer, done right by Bob Stevenson? Have I done right by Barry Tolkien? They gave and I took. And what did I do with the experiences they provided me with? Did I ever, on the page, pretend to be either one of them? What is my function as a storyteller in my society, if we divorce ourselves for the moment from the commercial complications that come with declaring oneself to be a writer or with actually publishing books, stories, and essays? Who decides who is a writer? And a far more difficult question, what are a writer's obligations to society? Let me, if it's all right, get directly to the point here. In seeking to characterize the writer's ethics in a modern society, industrialized, capitalized, mechanized, and competitive, I'm not speaking about the writer's obligations to herself, to her particular truth, to her integrity, or even to the traditions of the craft, which for me would include how one behaves, or to the importance of artistic vision and one's obligation, as I see it, to go deep. I'm referring instead to one's ethical obligation to the reader. In the history of storytelling, as I understand it, it is the narrative, the story, not the storyteller or the writer, that is more important. And it is the listener or the reader, not the writer, who grants authority to the writer or storyteller. The writer can't presume to be authoritative, nor indeed, and again from my point of view, can she assume to be an authority. I'm talking here mostly about fiction. A reporter, of course, is striving to write with authority, and we're well served by that effort. Where then is the general enterprise of writing fiction and nonfiction, I am asking myself, do my own ethical obligations to the reader and to the likes of Bob Stevenson and Barry Tolkien come into play? On several occasions over the years, I said that I believe the essence of good nonfiction writing lies with the intent behind two gestures, a bow of respect toward the material and a bow of respect toward the reader. If you'll bear with me for a moment, I'll try to characterize these two movements, which you might call gestures of respect. A bow toward the material means to take the subject matter seriously, interview people you don't like, go into places where you are unsure or not comfortable. Let the material come to you without immediate analysis or quick judgment. Those things come later in the process. A bow of respect toward the reader means do your homework. Read, for example, what others have to say about the subject. In your own prose, strive for clarity, for concision, and for memorable images. Use the thesaurus and a dictionary to ensure precision and to find a better level of connotation than the first word that comes to mind brings with it. Generally, think of yourself as the reader's companion, not the reader's instructor. It's always good to remember, too, that the reader might be smarter than you are, have a greater imagination than you do, or be better read. In general, the more apt your metaphors, the more illuminating your tropes, the more engaging the reader will find you. The goal, after all, is to be a great writer, not a great intellect. When I was in my 20s, I read a review of my first book, Desert Notes. in which the writer said that it was clear to him that I had been heavily influenced by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. I had not at the time heard of Borges, but I did start reading him. Some years before this, I was speaking with the late poet W.S. Merwin about influences on particular writers, and he said he thought it was amazing how far wide of the mark critics could sometimes be when they tried to identify the writers who had influenced you. And what did the word influence mean anyway? Did it mean you imitated another writer's prosody or employed her tropes or progressions in your work? Williams said he thought influence was more a matter of trying to do your own work with the same level of invention, integrity, and skill you found in someone else's work. If you consider influence in this way, it's much harder to discern who your influencers have been, because it's the overall nature of the writing, not the style or range of vocabulary or the tendencies of someone else's work that is inspiring you as you write. You are striving to do your own work well, but you admire, not envy, how well someone else does their work. At some strange level, then, you're actually collaborating with these other writers throughout your career, trying to get better at it, to go deeper, trying to make it more beautiful. Whenever I'm asked whose work has influenced me most, I tend to change the subject to prevent the person asking the question from making misleading connections. I have sometimes said, though, that something like this: I never took a class from Wendell Berry or from Wallace Stegner, but those two men taught me how to behave as a writer. As my life developed, I wanted to have an integrity that matched theirs. To be clear here, I too, of course, can hear the rhythms of Gerard Manley Hopkins, for example, in my prose, once they're pointed out, or recognize the affinities of Robinson Jeffers in my prose once somebody points it out. But these are incidental, not substantive, and of course subconscious allusions to the work of others. In the end, all you really want in your life work as a writer, I believe, is to have the integrity you find in the work of other people, some of whom might be writers. My friend Bob Stevenson was a great field biologist. He studied the lives of wolves and, not incidentally, undertook this work as a student of Nunamut hunters, people who have lived with the animal they call amaruk, not for a few seasons, but for hundreds of years. He then worked for a decade with lynx, and then he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to reintroduce wood bison into Alaska, which he finally did. I think you can say that in the general nightmare of wildlife management in the hands of well-meaning Europeans in North America, his life helped. My first real tutor, Barry Tolkien, left his Navajo family to get his undergraduate degree in English at Utah State, finished his master's at Washington State, and got his PhD in the University of Oregon. Later, he returned to Utah State and founded there the Department of American Folklore and continued teaching until a stroke incapacitated him. And until he could no longer travel, he returned every year to Blanding, Utah, with gifts for his Navajo relatives. He, too, like Bob Stevenson, was intent on serving his community. Whatever it is you're doing with your life, fine carpentry, musical composition, teaching second graders, studying wild animals, growing food, running a library, you hope to fashion your life after those who influenced you, who helped fashion you, to strive in your work for their grace and integrity, their humility, and their dedication. As you grow older, you come to understand that your desire to help, whatever it is you're doing, is guided not solely by those you met and were affected by when you were young, but also by your lifelong friends and colleagues who have endeavored to do work that matters, work that helps, even as the dark closes in. Something that took me a long while to understand as a writer is that when people outside your culture are trying to explain something to you, you must actually work to be able to hear, to detect simultaneously what you might call the metaphorical subtext, the story and the allegory within, to apprehend simultaneously the fact and the symbol. One fall evening in an Eskimo village, I'm slightly lost for a moment here, on the John River in the Brooks Range in Alaska, I ate dinner with others in someone's home. A man told a story about a wolverine. Then someone else told a story about a wolverine. And then another. An evening of stories about wolverine. When the talk turned to other topics, I put my parka on and went for a walk. It was cold but clear night. The physical distance in that great river valley felt towering and vast, welcoming the expansion of mind I had felt listening to the wolverine stories that lay beneath the series. What lay beneath the series of concrete, detailed encounters people described having had with these animals, scientific points about their biology and ecology, was a commentary on the temperament of the animal, the range of its emotions, its endurance and savviness. Biologists call this information anecdotal. For me, these stories further fleshed out an animal that, like every other animal, cannot finally be known. The creature is more than the sum of its neural impulses and endocrine secretions. It's a profound part of reality, good to learn about. As a writer, I have argued for and tried to support the sharing of information, especially in the form of stories that are not driven by an effort to be definitive or by assumptions of cultural superiority. Before this sort of exchange can work very well, however, the listener has to be in what you might call a metaphorical frame of mind, able to balance multiple interpretations simultaneously. My own culture often seems suspicious of metaphor, and so another door to intercultural cooperation at a crucial time in the history of humanity remains closed. This is not just sad to me, it's frightening. If we do not share stories and remain open to other ways of knowing, if we treat metaphor solely as a figure of speech and do not see its potential to illuminate the inexplicable, if we do not make peace with the non-literal world, we will remain stuck in a landscape of anxiety and despair. We will not be worthy of the imaginations we have. I write because I believe in the power of narrative to illuminate complexity, to make it more apprehensible. I believe in the power of narrative to heal, to make whole again the parts of ourselves that have begun to deteriorate. I write because it saves me from insanity, as other writers have said. I write because I care what happens to us, and I want to do whatever I can to lessen the pain and confusion in a time like no other in the history of humanity. I write because I have seen that by writing in such a way that the reader feels acknowledged and, if you will let me say it, loved, the reader is renewed, is empowered. I write because it gives me pleasure to know by reading my mail that a reader can recover through story a sense of self-worth. I know I do not write alone, but as part of the community to which I belong, this far-flung community of women and men, a community held together by and sustained by, if you will let me say it again, love. The late Eduardo Galeano, a Uruguayan writer in exile, wrote in an essay called In Defense of Words that the writer is the servant of memory, his own and the memory his community has carried through time. I would like to serve in that way, writing about what I have witnessed and what members of my community have witnessed. On a honeymoon in Paris, on the Washington Mall, when Martin Luther King told us he had a dream, in a trench at Khe Sanh in Vietnam for 73 days, in a blood-soaked field of the dead and dying, on an expedition to the interior of Antarctica. I do not want someone who never knew us to write our history and consign us to obscurity because we did not make good on our intentions. I am not interested in human barbarism as I am. I'm not as interested in human barbarism as a writer as I am in human dignity, in human failure as human survival. I believe if every writer discovers for herself what matters and finds the words to bring those thoughts to life, and if we remember that despite appearances and folklore, no one writes alone, that every writer in some mysterious way is a project of her community, then we will be all right. When I finish a book like Horizon, one of the parts I most look forward to is the writing of the acknowledgement section. It is here that you can step out of your role as a narrator and step into the role you have as a member of your community. You finally mention those who have helped you by name and thank them. You acknowledge the wisdom of those who informed you. You thank the fact checker and the line editor who kept you from embarrassing yourself. You thank neighbors and your children and your doctors if you've not been in a good way during the writing of the book. You thank those who influenced you and loved you and those who helped you see where you were falling short. You thank the community of which you are a part and hope readers read these words as an act of respect and courtesy, not a perfunctory list of lesser beings. When I return home next week to Oregon, I want to begin work on an essay about Bob Stevenson. He was a great person who, like most of us, was not well known, despite his pioneering work in wildlife management. Today, if you glance through the pages of, say, the Journal of Mammalogy, you will invariably come across the acronym TIK. The letters stand for Traditional Indigenous Knowledge. They refer to the kind of insight into the behavior of wild animals that indigenous people have because they have been paying close attention and keeping rigorous mental notes for centuries, not decades. Bob Stevenson was one of the first Western biologists to advocate for the importance, the veracity, and the utility of this kind of knowledge, and nearly 50 years ago began lobbying to have this information included in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and I want to say that this was one of the reasons why his life mattered. He was a generous person to a fault. He had a terrific sense of humor. He loved dogs, and like most of us, he was knocked to his knees by the vicissitudes of life, and he took a long time to get up. He was part of the reason I wrote, not just about wolves, but wrote at all. I want to thank him because it is an ethical obligation to do so, but also because without stories of people like him, I think we will not have enough good stories to sustain us as the clouds on the horizon turn dark. Thank you. there's any questions, I'll try to answer them. Or we can all go to dinner or something, you know. Anybody? Yeah.
So having been to Antarctica, we briefly spoke before
Right.
you appeared. Can you tell me a little bit about your experiences in this amazing continent?
Well, sure. I spent a lot of time in the Arctic. I've forgotten, 18 trips or something like that. And, of course, became curious about Antarctica, the, antithesis. I don't think so. But I knew I would find something different, that I would be able to say, well, it's the same color, but that's about it. So, and that indeed was my thought the first time I flew into McMurdo, that it had similar contours and it was white, but beyond that, no. Really different, really its own thing. So the first trip was an orientation trip, and then I came back to drill for ice core in the Transantarctic Mountains, and camped once with some other people about less than 200 miles, I think, from South Pole. And then I went with a group of benthic ecologists I'd worked with before, and we dove under the ice in McMurdo Sound for 3 weeks. And then I took my oldest daughter when I accepted an invitation to lecture on an ecotourism vessel. So I kept going back to Antarctica because I knew it was an instrument that I was trying to learn a tune on, and in my experience, there is no tabula rasa like that continent. When we were camped in the Transantarctics at a place called Graves Nunataks, we were the only people that had ever been there. And you can verify that by going to U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. The human history of Antarctica is so shallow that they can tell you whether anybody ever was ever in one place or another. So every day you're waking up in a place that no one had ever been in, and we were looking for meteorites, so we were looking for things that were literally not of this earth, and it gave you a great perspective every day just to start with. So I talked about it in Horizon as the siren song for me. It kept saying this, then I got old. Anything else? Yeah.
So you talk about the role of the writer and being in place to help retain the memory, not just of one writer, but then also the community. All of that just takes an enormous amount of energy. Maybe I'm curious to hear how you start to draw connections, or how you would describe your approach in terms of an endurance or stamina to stay focused in that practice of keeping your mind open or your awareness open to a community.
I read in, not about me, it's just a phrase, but I thought, wow. I read that I was ferociously attentive, and that ferocity is something that you have to bring to bear, I think, when you are in a place. You've got to be paying attention. If you're tired or you're hungry, too bad. The world is unfolding, and in all of that magnificence, if you want to go to sleep, wow. So that's my particular obsession. But I think of every person who does what I do, travel, stay with other people other than the ones that are in your family or in your culture. You're an apprentice. So you've got to be comfortable, especially I think with Native people, you can't be afraid of looking foolish. You will look foolish. And you have to accept the fact that in environments where traditional people have been abused, there is a tendency to abuse you just to see what happens. And you get to a point where you have to stand your ground, and then usually it's pretty good. And even when you're traveling, you remember your children, and you remember your spouse, and you remember everyone you ever loved. And because you do, you're an extension of your community all the time. So you read other people's work because other people paid more attention than you did. They came from a different place, whatever it is. But for you, some wonderful things happened in 1990 with a Wasco woman named Lillian Pitt, who's now been an old friend of mine for many years. We both got the Governor's Award in Oregon, and she did a couple of things I thought were really good. It's a great big auditorium jammed with people, and she came up to the microphone and pointed out these 6 women in traditional dress in the first row and said, "I wonder if everybody would stand and recognize my teachers instead of having them stand, and be identified." It was a beautiful thing to do. And in Green Room, she said to me, we were talking about how even though you live in an American society that's pushing you all the time to be an individual, but you are a member of a community. And how do you negotiate that? So we were talking about that, and she said, "Barry, I'm a project of my people," meaning, I hope I'm doing okay, And I retained that idea, the way you retain things that you hear as guides. And if I got in a bad place, a physically challenging place, and became worried, I would run that in my mind. Be a project of your community, get off your ass. I didn't say that, but I loved being in places that were defiant and who said to you, "I'll show you." Not because I'm a tough guy, because I'm not, but because it brought something out of me. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago for a British journal called Granta. They had asked several writers to write about being afraid. And the incident I chose to use as an illustration or a setting was the first time I began diving in Antarctica. You come through a hole in 6 feet of ice, and that's the only way out. So if you lose direction or something, you will not get out. And I remember that day gearing up and talking with my dive partners. Something welled up in me, which was a combination of my great trust of those people. I dived with them in other places. I knew them. I knew we didn't have anybody trying to prove herself or himself. And I knew that I loved them, and that I was as enthusiastic as they were about benthic ecology. And we were going in this together, and wow. And all of that energy of being in a community, not being the first person on the mountain or something, but being a part of something with other women and men, seeing it, feeling it, and stepping into it. And fear just disintegrated. I think you have to prepare. You can't be an idiot. You have to prepare, be technically a good diver in that situation, and pick really good people to work with. And then you just look at each other and go. And the elevation of the spirit, the possibility of seeing something that no one had seen before, or doing, making really good collections of benthic organisms. If I could, I'd do it tomorrow again, because we all loved each other so much. And I felt that same way in some storms that, snowstorms where we got really badly weathered out. And when 6 days later, in one instance, we could finally get out of the tents, we looked at each other, and the quality of the hug was worth the whole trip. Something, yeah. No, you go ahead. I don't have anything.
You talked about your culture's suspicion of metaphor.
Yeah.
And you offered an example of integrating traditional indigenous knowledge in scientific journals as a way to intervene in that suspicion of metaphor.
Right.
Do you have other ideas, other ways to intervene in that?
Yeah.
Other ideas about how to intervene in that suspicion?
Well, what I was talking about there was racist. The belief that because a person's skin is dark and they have not got a television or a PhD, that somehow they're an idiot. In my experience, they're the people that really know. And because they don't talk about it all the time, the assumption that they don't know is jejune. How can you come up with an idea like that? So what people like Bob Stevenson did was to say, hey, if you want to know about this animal, you got to ask these people. You can't just send a bunch of 20-year-olds with radio collars and things out there and figure it out. It can't be figured out. I remember a friend of mine, I can't remember his name now, I haven't seen him in a million years, but he told me when he was working in, I actually think he was in Manitoba, but there were a couple of young men from Wildlife Services, Canadian Wildlife Services, that were coming to understand polar bears because Arctic drilling and transport of petroleum was going to really interrupt their lives. So he said that one day he was standing with these 3 Inuit people, men, and it amuses Eskimo people to see other people do this, the gestures that take in a larger part of the world than you occupy. So here were these 2 young men standing out there. They were telling you where the polar bears were going. And these 3 Inuit men were standing there like this. And one of them says, which was Inuktitut for, you can't figure it out. And that means that you have made your peace with the unfathomable and become, instead of an observer, a participant. Where I thought your question was going is we really don't know how to look around. We do not understand how to use our senses. We get locked in behind this little cell phone camera. We get locked in on the screen of the computer, get locked in on television, get locked in on all these 2-dimensional surfaces, and try to fit experiential knowledge there. So you travel with people who never turn around. What? They never turn around, never look up, never look down. They are totally A to B. They are not in the journey. They're already on the other side of the journey. And I remember traveling with some people one time. We were traveling with dogs, and we weren't quite sure where we were. And so we asked we got in a little settlement, it really wasn't a village, and asked these guys, we told them where we wanted to go and asked them how would we recognize that place as we approached it, because we were in and out of the coast and mostly on the sea ice, just white. So they told us what it looked like. And we thought, all right, we're set now. So we took off, summertime, a lot of light. And we got to where we knew we wanted to go, but it didn't look like they said it looked. And we thought, what? So the next morning, when we left, somebody turned around. And when they did, they saw it looked like what these people said it would look like. Because it didn't occur to them that to know a place was to know it only with only one elevation. So those things teach you all the time. Look around, pay attention. Don't become satisfied with what you've seen in the first moment. I wrote an essay about this called The Invitation, about coming on a grizzly bear that was dismantling a caribou carcass, and how I was focused on the bear eating the caribou, and the guys that I were with were doing this. And then lock on and like this. That was a moment in a very large event, and they didn't pay 100% attention to it. They paid attention to everything else. So later they knew how to situate it in the meaning of life, So you can remind yourself when you're traveling to get off the screen, to step in the world, participate in the world, and not treat the world as an object that's there for your observation. It's great to travel with. I said to a guy one time, I was trying to explain how white people use the word empty. And we were on tundra that a white person might say, not to denigrate my own people, but would say, well, it's just empty. There's nothing there. It's a wasteland. And he let the beat fall, and then he said, warehouse of instant tools. So you think that you haven't got it in your pocket. It's right there on the ground. You can pick it up and do a little bit, and it'll be fine. Another one, which I think is actually funnier, was in a similar situation somewhere. This older man came up to me, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, Barry, you're always thinking. Not a compliment. Which he was trying to say in a nice way. All right, maybe one more question, and then we can go out the door. Yes?
One line that resonated with me that you said was that if I hadn't believed it, I would not have seen it.
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting, because most of the time we hear, see to believe. So I was wondering if you could just expand kind of on the context of that.
All right, so philosophers use this word called epistemology. It means a culture has a way of rank ordering everything in the visible universe according to its value or its importance. Every culture does that differently. So in a moment, what you think is the most important thing, someone from another culture puzzles about why you set that up like that. So what Barry Tolkien was trying to say to us that day in that classroom is, if you maintain, which is characteristic of our culture, a very rational, logical approach to the world, which is always buzzing on the edge of analysis. If you stop trying to analyze everything and say, as an alternative, participate in it, then you see the same thing the other person is looking at quite differently. So what Barry was trying to say was, having married into this family, into Yellowman's family, and spending daily time with them, preparing meals and just fixing the flat on the car and just being in that world, he absorbed a way of seeing the world that was foreign to him. And then when he saw something, he thought, I never would have noticed that unless I believed that it existed, which I do because of the way I've been trained by the people I'm with. So I think for somebody in our culture, it's a admonition to free yourself of the subconscious strictures that are there that prevent us from seeing more possibilities, that we can easily be defeated by something, see no possibility for the solution to that problem. But if you're standing with somebody from another culture, they can say, oh, I can tell you how to look at that and we'll find a solution. So if the world that we are living in now is made worse, deadlier, stupider by our inability to listen to people in other cultures, then the way to rectify that situation and provide ourselves with substantive hope about global climate change or ocean acidification or the bad sister that's coming, methane, if we can find some way to believe in another way of seeing without giving up your own way of seeing, then you see possibilities for cooperation that just have not been there for human beings in the past. Our inability to cooperate, our conviction that we know and others don't know, is killing us. So every time I've traveled with indigenous people, I have thought, how fortunate. Of course I don't know, and I miss everything. I had a friend of mine, Richard K. Nelson, the best anthropologist working in Alaska, I'd say, in the last 50 years. And he told me that when he was a young man, so 40 or 50 years ago, he was on the Kayakuk River with Koyukon people, Athabascan people, and they'd gone down river, which is typical, nobody saying anything, not using language to collapse reality into meaning, just letting reality stream and get in the river with it. So they went down river on the Kayakuk and got out, made camp, and Dick said to me, you know, I missed everything, but I had a lot to say. It's so typical for us, hey, I saw this and I saw that, yak, yak, yak. And really you missed everything because you're so intent on finding meaning that you absent yourself from the atmosphere in which all these simultaneous events are occurring, Bob Stevenson, I mentioned once, he was out with a guy, Bob Aguk. They were looking in a narrow valley for wolf dens. And Bob Stevenson was ahead and Bob Aguk was behind him. And Bob said, like that, this bird went by him, and he turned and looked at it, and then he couldn't wait to turn around and say, Bob Aguk, hey, did you see that robin? And Bob Aguk said to him, yeah, wolf den. And he pointed out that although Bob Stevenson had seen a robin fly by very quickly, Bob Aguk had seen a robin fly by very quickly with 4 or 5 long hairs that had reddish tips, and you could tell they were wolf guard hairs, but the only wolf that has guard hairs like that is a lactating female. And Bob Aguk looked at the angle that the bird came past them and extrapolated it like this and looked up and saw a shelf on 40, 50 feet up on the side of this hill. And he knew that to get away from those clawing puppies, a female wolf had come out and lay down up there. So Bob Stevenson saw a robin and was really glad to be able to tell Bob what it was. And Bob had seen a robin and knew that we need to walk up there and we'll find a wolf den. So when you have experiences like that, it wakes you up. It encourages your own humility. And when your humility is encouraged, you become a sponge. Thanks very much.